Hey everybody, we're taking a look here at chapter 19, and chapter 19 is going to be a little bit different, right? For the last couple of chapters, we've been taking a look at the presidencies of LBJ and Nixon and Ford from the perspective of things primarily at home and abroad, right? So we looked at civil rights, which was primarily in the presidency of Johnson's, right? Then we looked at minority rights, which took place for both Johnson and Nixon. And we also took a look at the Vietnam War, which was taking place for both Johnson and Nixon. But really, there's something else going on in chapter 19 that we haven't really had a chance to kind of get into too much, and that's what happens during the rest of the 1970s under Richard Nixon, because the minority rights movement is primarily the late 60s, early 70s. Civil rights movement is primarily over by the 1970s. Vietnam War, Nixon gets us out of that. So what else happens in the 1970s underneath Richard Nixon? And so what we're looking at here is what Nixon does at home. And as a presidential candidate, Richard Nixon really wanted to appeal to all the Americans that were out there who supported the government who wanted the craziness of the 1960s to end, the turmoil of it. And he called this group Middle America, the silent majority. His argument was that most of America, most of the middle class, wanted things to go back to the way they were. They were tired of all this change. They were tired of all the protests, tired of all the demonstrations, tired of the riots. They wanted things to go back the way they were. And here's the quote that he said, that he used, and you can see it right up here. "Tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support." You know, and he got it. And there was another candidate who did that too, by the way. A guy who said it's time for all the craziness to end. A guy that wants things to go back to the way they used to be. And that was Donald Trump. And here you can see him bringing out the same thing that Nixon talked about, the silent majority. His argument was that the silent majority of Americans want things to go back to the way they were. They don't want things to change. And Nixon wins against Democrat Hubert Humphrey and a states' rights candidate from the South named George Wallace. And Trump won this year. So that argument really carries a lot of weight with some people. And once he's in office, he's going to do a lot to try and make that come true, make that actually happen, get rid of that craziness. So, interestingly enough, as President, Richard Nixon is more interested in things going on in the other parts of the world, in foreign affairs, than he is here in things going on at home, what we would call domestic policy. So with that being true, Nixon is going to start a new approach to containment. Remember, containment is stopping communism from spreading. Nixon's approach to this, to the communist countries who were out there, was called détente. And he explains this as kind of an understanding between nations that want something different. They have opposite purposes, but they share a common interest, right? So think about it like this. We are, in fact, a democracy, right? We're capitalist. And the Soviets are communist. So here's a cartoon, right? Whoop. And there we have America, right, in its eagle form, and we have the Soviets in their bear form, but they have a common interest, this little baby, right? We have mom and pop, and we have this little baby. Well, what's the little baby, you ask? What's the common interest? Well, the common interest is the world, and a fear that we might end up destroying it in global war. So how can we prevent that from happening? Remember, at the time, the United States was stuck in the Vietnam War. So we've got to have a better relationship with our rivals to get peace. So Nixon does things like visit communist China to encourage the Soviets to pursue diplomacy. The idea here would be that if he can show the Soviets that he's friendly with China, then maybe they'd be more likely to be friends with us, right? Like if I can be friends with a person that, maybe I don't like, maybe another person that I don't like can be friends with me too. So Nixon, as he's making friends with all of these different groups of people, is looking for ways to become better friends with the Soviet Union. And he figures out one way, and it goes back to this whole issue of what do we not want to happen, which is to destroy the world in nuclear war. So he approaches the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, a guy named Brezhnev, and he says, let's sign a treaty. Let's sign the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, SALT. And he says, well, let's exchange scientific information. Your scientists share with ours, and ours will share with you. We'll trade more, and we'll freeze the number of nuclear weapons that we have. Because, as you can see in that chart here, that each side had thousands of nuclear weapons at its disposal. And really, we don't need to risk nuclear war, right? We have a common interest, and that's survival. So let's have this Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and let's make some positive changes. And for all of Nixon's successes and the positive changes that he brings about with détente, being better friends with China, better friends with the Soviet Union, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, it's going to come crashing down. Because towards the end of his first term, which was going to be up in 1972, something happens. Five guys break into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. And that was in this hotel right here that I circled above my head. It's called the Watergate Office Complex. It's a hotel now. And they break into the office of the Democratic National Committee to help Nixon get reelected. And they're arrested, these guys. They're arrested. In the wake of this break-in, reporters discover that one of the burglars, a guy named James McCord, he wasn't just an ex-CIA official, which is interesting enough. He's also a member of the Committee for the Re-election of the President. And so people begin to wonder, well, wait a minute, this guy, James McCord, this guy up here, he works on a commission to re-elect the president? I wonder if Nixon had anything to do with this. And so people start poking around. What we don't know at the time is that while people are beginning to investigate this, President Nixon is actually using his power to cover up his involvement. He ordered all kinds of things, like documents to be destroyed about the break-in. He orders phones to be wiretapped. He even calls up the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, our spies, the CIA, to pressure the FBI and tell them to stop investigating in who paid the burglars. So, I mean, the President of the United States is using his power to try and stop people from investigating what was going on. Yeah, all that being said, remember, nobody knew Nixon was doing those things at that time. So Nixon is going to be reelected in the fall of 1972. He says that he's got no connection to it. He says, nope, I didn't know anything about it at all. 1973, the burglars go on trial. In one of them, a guy named John Dean, he says that the Watergate break-in was ordered by a guy named the Attorney General, John Mitchell. It's his title, Attorney General. His name's John Mitchell. And he's the most important advisor to the President of the United States when it comes to the law. And John Dean makes a claim that Nixon was involved in the cover-up. And so for the first time now, Nixon's already been reelected, we have a president being identified as taking part in the cover-up of this break-in. A couple of months later, July of 73, Congress discovers that Nixon has tapes in his office, and that in his office, every conversation was recorded. Nixon wanted to avoid turning over these tapes, saying that it would violate national security. There's too many conversations that go on in the White House that Congress can't hear about. He says executive privilege is at play here. And executive privilege is the principle that the White House conversation should be confidential to protect national security. And Congress doesn't buy it. In fact, they go to court to get control of those tapes. Nixon loses in court to Congress. Congress hears the tapes, and they realize the president broke the law, and they're going to impeach him. They impeach him on obstructing justice, impeach him on misusing the government, to violate the rights of citizens, defying the authority of Congress. And Nixon resigns from the presidency in disgrace. And not long after, the new president, a guy named Gerald Ford, he was vice president under Nixon. When Nixon leaves, Gerald Ford becomes president. And Ford announces a full pardon for Nixon, and this is your short answer. And he says that this is a tragedy, where we've all been exposed to this tragedy. And this tragedy could go on and on and on and on unless somebody puts an end to it. And to avoid a public trial then, and, prevent this whole thing from dragging on and creating a negative climate in our country, Gerald Ford issues a pardon for Richard Nixon. It's a little slip of paper right there above my head that he types up and sends, and it says that that Nixon can't be arrested for anything he did in office. Now, this really makes some Americans angry because Nixon gets away with it. A lot of Americans distrust the government, in part because Nixon lied and cheated and abused power, in part because Ford pardoned him. So yeah, it's a mess of a situation, and it's one that our country still deals with. And we'll talk some more about that in class.